Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. E na rau rangatira mā, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Koutsaho, ko te kārahi o te patea whai whakaro, nā reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tihei Māori ora. So very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm CEO of the charity Mindful Money. We're meeting in the very last seminar in this current series, which started off actually with COP27 in the very first episode of the series, and appropriately closes with this year's Climate Summit, COP28. Videos and podcasts of the previous seminars are available on Mindful Money's website, on YouTube, and all other good websites and Facebooks and so on, all over internet. Today we're, as I said, looking at the issues from COP28, from for the outcomes, and off the press we have Rod Oram joining us from a very kind airport lounge in on his way back to New Zealand. So thank you very much for getting up at an impossibly early hour to join us, Rod. And fresh from having returned and actually having seen Joe at a meeting last night, a very warm welcome to Joe Kelly. So I think Rod and Joe need no great long introduction. Rod is a business, financial journalist, a researcher, a columnist, an environmentalist, a sustainability wizard, and has a tremendous following in New Zealand, fully deservedly. And thank you very much for your reporting from COP28 as well as your other reporting, Rod. And Joe is our other guest. Joe is CEO of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, where she has built a fantastic program of work, and it's making a real difference in terms of the way finance can be shifted away from its current position towards sustainability. So thank you very much for joining us as well, Joe. So let's crack straight into it. I think maybe if we start off with the substantive bit, and it's the negotiations themselves. And they appear, Rod, to have been pretty contentious, particularly with a rather controversial chair of the negotiations. Do you want us to lead through what struck you as the big issues, the wins, the disappointments from the negotiations?
Kia ora tātou, and well, good afternoon to you. It's still morning for me here. I would start this way, that I took a long time to come around to the idea that having a petrostate and a petrostate chief executive as a president of COP was a good idea. But I think it's turning out to be, because the Emirati are trying to build a diversity economy, particularly here in Dubai. It's already making good strides in being a global center for green finance, for example. And I think it takes one of those petrol heads to be able to talk to other petrol heads. And that's what's going on. And we don't know the outcome, because we only got the final draft text landed at 6 o'clock yesterday evening here, and the negotiations on it only start this morning. Theoretically, Al Jaber, the chair, the president, said that he would call the closing plenary at 11 o'clock this morning. Well, there's no chance of that. This is going to go on for at least another 24 hours. But whilst there was a bit of a shock last night with that final text, that draft final text, because there was no fossil fuel phase out language in there, I think it's on reflection on this overnight, I think it's actually a very clever text, because Saudi Arabia and everybody else saying, no phase out of fossil fuels. But what this is talking about is both consumers and producers reducing emissions. That means that it broadens the responsibility base, if you like. It's not entirely pointing fingers at the producers. And I think that's right, because in a sense, we're all complicit because we still use fossil fuels. I'm just about to burn up a lot getting on a plane. I think that is actually quite an interesting starting point for these very intense negotiations. What we then had was a lot of anguish. For example, the small island states last night. Wonderful quote from the Marshall Islands about we won't go. You won't push us into our watery grave. But crucially, the EU said that it was wholly unacceptable, and the US said that further advances had to be made. So you could take that quite neutral language and over the negotiations over the next 24, 36 hours, extend that by building more into it. So the game is far, far from over yet. And I think that Al Jaber and the Emirati have been pretty good on that. In fact, talking to a senior diplomat here, he felt that their political skills in the couple of years running up to them hosting and chairing COP, they were as good almost as the British in terms of how well they're prepared. So they've got the diplomatic skills, and they're talking sort of brother to brother amongst other producers. So that's the big thing to watch out for. What else is going on, of course, that's only part of the global stock take required by the Paris Agreement. And this is the first time that all the commitments of the countries of the world are being considered and their progress as to how well they're aligning with the Paris targets. Well, they're not. So this COP is about putting a whole lot more into the program to try and achieve that. So the overall text will be important. And there's already crucial parts of that we know, such as a big commitment to doubling renewables and I think a 50% increase in energy efficiency and things like that. Then the next thing is there needs to be something in there about the goal it's called on global adaptation. That did horribly in the negotiations because it became unstuck very early on, because it turned out that we have no metrics for measuring the resilience of nature in an economy, and no draft text was advanced. Some draft language is in there now, and that would set up all the right sort of processes to start getting those metrics. So we can consider that a bit of a tick. Loss and damage was amazing because it only reluctantly got onto the agenda because the developed countries had refused to have it on the agenda for decades at COP in Egypt last year. And right first day, we had an agreement on that. The money is miserable. And so there's a long way to go on that.
So maybe, Rod, just a very
Yep.
quick note for those who may be unfamiliar with the loss and damage
Oh,
issue. This is where a climate-related natural disaster affects generally a vulnerable developing country. There is now agreed to be a mechanism whereby they would receive compensation for essentially the loss and damage as a result of the climate event. But as you say, Rod, the level of money is still fairly minuscule to
yeah.
cover what are often huge costs, even though some of the nations are quite small and quite undeveloped.
Yes. Now, there's a whole lot on finance, and I'll
Yeah.
leave Jo to talk to that because she's obviously been focusing intently on that, and I haven't. But I'll just make one comment on finance. Is the UAE and the president saying, oh, it's fantastic. Last time I looked, it was $83 billion of new finance for climate. And you say, well, fine, but that's only about half what the UAE is planning to invest in more fossil fuel development over the next 10 years. That's just the UAE, right? So that's just a simple benchmark by which we can consider that. So overall, this COP will disappoint like every COP, but I think there is some really important progress, tantalizingly close, and we'll know in the next 24 or 36 hours how much of that lands.
Fantastic, Rod. And just to follow up on that, was there Was there anything in there that maybe a gem that you discovered that you thought was a really important issue that didn't really get much attention? I know food and agriculture were on the agenda. There are a few other things that aren't immediate for immediate agreement.
Nature. So nature was on the agenda with a theme day. That sounds so hokey. It almost sounds like, Disneyland or something. Um, was a theme day, as indeed was agriculture. And nothing of great substance has got into the cover agreement, as it's called, on nature. And again, it's because we don't know how to frame those goals. So I think this is actually really important, not to lament that, but realize that that's how far behind we are behind on understanding nature and what we need to do to get it into programs. I think New Zealand made an interesting contribution to that, because the recloaking Papatūānuku proposal from Pure Advantage, at large scale, 2.1 million hectares, about $12 billion of investment. It would do wonders for our NDC and meeting that. That's the sort of large scale, big new thinking that's required. And in the welter of things in COP, that hasn't yet achieved much attention, I don't think. Agriculture also, first time it's had this prominence, but the roadmap from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, agriculture and net zero by 2050, is very skeletal. And there is still huge tension within FAO between those people in FAO who are still a great fan of livestock and those who aren't. And that conflict comes through very clearly. But still, this is haltingly new territory.
Great. Thank you, Rod. That's terrific. Joe, would you like to add some comments on finance to that?
Yeah, thank you, Barry, for having me. I'm so glad Rod got to go first because, as you said, I have been not focused so much on the broader negotiations, and that was a great theme setter. Thank you, Rod. But paying quite a lot of attention to the position that New Zealand is taking on the finance discussion. And so, in terms of the finance piece, our negotiators have to look at finance negotiation in two ways. There's one part that deals with global financial flows and making them consistent with the Paris objectives, if we're ever going to attain them, and so that deals with holding average temperature increase and the adaptation and resilience piece. And then there's also climate finance as a term, which generally means those flows from developed to developing countries. And as we've covered, there was that announcement of the operationalization of the Loss and Damage Fund with $700 million, I think, initially, which I think the conversation is now officially in the billions and trillions. So, as Rod said, it seems to be more of a symbolic gesture than a really meaningful financial one. So I guess some parties, some countries and parties to the negotiations take the view that the negotiations about finance should happen between states and that the private sector doesn't have the requisite accountability. So the global finance flows, that whole piece of the conversation is somewhat of a distraction from those important state-to-state negotiations. And at the centre, really, our focus is on how well positioned New Zealand is for incoming flows of green capital as capital starts to be reallocated around the world. It hasn't been so much on the development finance that New Zealand would send outwards. But I think what is really significant is that at a fundamental level, as capital does get reallocated globally, the better positioned New Zealand is to be in that flow of green capital, then the better place we are to then meet our international development commitments. So it is important that our negotiators are focused on and supportive of progress in both of those domains. And they have been, yeah.
Right. And talking about New Zealand, Rod, it was kind of an interesting conference of the parties for the government, being in between governments with both the outgoing Minister James Shaw there as well as the incoming minister. How did you feel that New Zealand was perceived in the negotiations? There's obviously been some publicity around things like New Zealand getting awarded a fossil of the day, uh,
Yeah.
not the kind of prize that you want to win, but it's a prize for being obstructive. Was that representative of the rest of the participants and the delegates, or was that
It, it was
bit
New
harsh?
Zealand's one moment of profile, I'd say, in 2 weeks. That
Right,
sounds a bit harsh,
right.
but I need to
Yep.
distinguish some things. First of all, we have a very small negotiating team here, people from NFAT and MPI, etc. They are immensely good and very skilled, and they are playing good roles in negotiating rooms, doing the classic New Zealand thing of trying to understand where people are going and trying to help. That's really good. And Kay Harrison, our climate ambassador, stroke chief negotiator, co-chaired one of the working parties in the first week. So that's good. But we came to COP with nothing. Even if we had a change of government, we would have changed. We would have still hadn't had a change of government. We'd have still come to COP with nothing, except backsliding on various commitments that had prior been made. So we don't have a country pavilion, and yet there are countries like Denmark, similar population to us, that have very impressive pavilions. So we are extremely, extremely low profile. And so when the chief executive of Fonterra, Miles Hurrell, turns up to albeit only make introductory comments at an opening session of the Global Dairy Platform on its pathways to dairy net zero, and he is also chair of the GDP. There were 6 people in the audience. And so that's why, I'm sorry about the background noise. They don't usually call flights here. That's really interesting. Anyway, so the point is,
carry on. We're
you're
not
not
hearing the
okay.
background noise.
And so a very, very, very low profile. And don't just blame it on the change of government. Blame it on a lack of action and insufficient action, but also insufficiently outward looking in New Zealand.
Yep. And the new minister, Simon Watts, new minister of climate change, appeared to strike a conciliatory and coalition building note, and reaching out to different stakeholders and across political lines. Was that your observation?
Yes, but let's see how that translates into actual action.
Right, right.
Would
Joe,
be the only thing I'm interested in.
Yeah. Joe, your impression of dynamics of New Zealand's role in the negotiations and COP28 more generally?
Yeah, so I guess I would agree with Rod that our negotiators are working hard and we do have a low profile. As Rod said, we don't have a country pavilion. I think we do have a mandate that the negotiators are working to, that was set by the previous government, and that is available online. We also have very senior representatives from agencies. The chief executive of the Ministry for the Environment is part of the delegation, and I think that's probably not typical. And we have 130 plus private sector contingent through the overflow passes. So while we don't have a huge official delegation of negotiators and representatives of the government, we did have a lot of people on the ground from New Zealand, including myself and Rod, and that was made available by the government, and permitted access to the blue zone, which is the area of the COP where you aren't permitted to be unless you're part of sort of an official or semi-official delegation. So that was really good, and I hope that that's something that the government will continue to do in the future, because what it enables the officials to do is have eyes and ears all across the blue zone and feed back into them things that we're seeing and hearing from other pavilions and things that might be pertinent to their own negotiations. And so that was I think, a really positive development for New Zealand at COP. It was the first year that it was able to happen. And the officials held briefings for that contingent of private sector and NGO representatives and media representatives each day, which enabled us to deep dive into one of the negotiating points. So again, that was a level of openness and transparency that was really welcomed by those of us who aren't negotiators. As far as the minister is concerned, so I was quite heartened by his approach, which runs counter to some of what we've been seeing in New Zealand media about the sort of the posturing that some of our political leaders are doing. Minister Watts, as an incoming minister who had not previously attended COP, I think made a very shrewd move in having James Shaw there, just for that transfer and the succession of knowledge and relationships that James has garnered over the many years of going. I think that the minister was very thoughtful and open to questions and open to challenge. And while, as I'm with Rod, like to see where we are a year from now and see how that translates into action, I think as an initial posture and an initial way of showing up to this conversation, he's done a good job of being thoughtful and observing and sort of learning about what's going on. It would be really hard to come to COP and not have been affected by it in one way or the other. And so I am heartened by that approach. The minister was presented with a letter from NGOs on the oil and gas exploration that's happening here at home, and he took it in good faith. Again, we'll see what happens with that, but he was open to that conversation. So I feel generally encouraged by, the way that New Zealand is presenting itself.
Yeah, I know
I'm very. Oh, so can I just jump straight in, because I should probably leave in a few minutes, I'm sorry to say. I'm very keen to hear, once I get home, chatting to people from business who are here, because this is the first time there's been more than a handful. And in the past, they've just been quite small organizations. We had some major companies represented here to see what they made of it. And COP can be a bit putting because of the sheer scale of it. And so I hope they feel that it was worth their time. So that would be a test. But here's the test for the government. If over the next 24 hours, there is some really significant progress on fossil fuels, the government will have learned, if Watts comes home and says, the landscape shifted here internationally, and what we pledged in our election manifesto actually is untenable now, and we need to front that and just say, look, that's what we were campaigning on then, but this is such a big change, such a pivotal point at COP, and such a pivotal moment in the Paris Agreement. We're actually not going to do that. We're actually going to push on far harder with renewables. We're going to make use of the gas we have left, which is actually quite a lot. That, to me, is actually going to be one of the key tests of whether this new government has got anything out of COP at all.
And other issues as well, like the promotion of EVs and the review of the emissions trading scheme and so on. So maybe a revisiting of some of those other policies may also be on the cards. Rod, I realise you have to go, and certainly don't want you to be late for your flight. Any final thoughts, and kind of in a way what this all means, and are you heartened by what you've seen over the last week or so?
Yes, what I've seen has been a far greater intensity of understanding, of ambition, and the rest across all stakeholders, not just NGOs or business, but government negotiators as well. So this feels like a very different COP, even from Glasgow and then Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt last year. So I'm very interested in that, and I come away heartened in that respect. And whilst my hopes would be, think realistic about what could be achieved over the next 24 hours, I'm still holding on to a very significant signal to governments in their policies and in their NDCs, business in terms of its strategies towards net zero, all stakeholders across society, they will get a very clear signal out of this. But the signal I'm most interested in is that if the language is clear enough and firm enough on fossil fuels, the real test of that is whether we start to see a drastic revaluation of oil and gas companies in stock markets, for example, where analysts are going, oh, maybe they're not going to be able to burn as much as we thought they were going to do, and we're going to knock back their our estimates of their value on the stock exchange. That to me is going to be really, really interesting, and that would be one way to measure, one of only a number of ways to measure how effective this COP's been, because that would then start to show the fossil fuel companies actually the game's up, because they just, it's very clear. I was writing a piece about this in Newsroom this morning, that they just are not seeing that the winds of politics, of technology, of climate, of societal license to operate are shifting so fast, and they're just not getting it. And so if they get any kind of signal from this COP that makes them more aware of those shifting winds, those shifting tides, then this will have been a good COP.
Very good. And just on that, Rod, there was a very interesting little segment with Genesis and the new transition away from coal, considering that their share price was considerably lower than its competitors who are further down the renewable track. And that was quantified at around 20%. So there does appear to be, in a way, a discounting of share values for fossil fuels, but maybe it doesn't take into account the full extent of the write down of the stranded assets as fossil fuels volumes start to fall.
Yeah, and the quite dramatic change in strategy at Genesis, I think, is really fascinating. Yeah. About new thinking by a new CEO. And that's just the kind of new thinking that we need to get through these legacy issues. I'm going to have to go. I'm sorry about this.
Thank you so much, Rod.
Anyway, lovely to see you.
Okay, we'll see you back here.
Thanks. Right.
Thanks,
bye.
Rod.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Joe, let's follow up on some of those strands, and particularly, I'm really interested in your perception of some of those blue zone events and what you saw in the blue zone that was surprising to you or new to you or kind of noteworthy, because these are all kind of business, non-governmental agencies, research institutes, opinion formers of various types. What struck you?
Yeah, sure. So there's three things that I think really stood out for me from the COP, and it was from the blue zone, but then also across to the green zone as well. So those three things were the need for a level of ambition and coordination and to some degree storytelling at a national level, an honest discussion or an emerging honesty in the discussion about the need for commercial returns in order for commercial money to move at scale. And then also, I was really struck by the fact that regardless of what's happening in the negotiations, there's a move to execution, right? And there's a move to discussion about how we close the gap between the sort of high level commitments at a country level or within the financial sector, let's say, and then the actual movement in the real economy. Yeah.
Cool. And is that from the perception of seeing climate change increasingly as an opportunity rather than a threat? Is that, there's always been this climate change is kind of a risk and a problem for us, versus perhaps a smaller number who are saying, wow, look at these opportunities. Is that part of the shift that's going on?
Yeah, I think in sustainability circles, we've been making the case for a long time for a sort of enlightened self-interest. Yeah. And I don't know actually even how enlightened it is at this point. I think it's just flat. vanilla variety self-interest. So people are galvanized by events that are happening in their own homes, right, and in their own jurisdictions, and they're also starting to realize that there's no global transition without a transition in the global south. So that really lends itself to the kind of blended finance conversation. And we are, even though it feels sometimes like the progress is slow since Paris gave a galvanizing framework, and then we've been busy creating the tools to sort of achieve some of the things that Paris laid out or challenged us to achieve. And so the tools of the finance sector, like disclosures, like taxonomies, like data infrastructure, we've been working on those, and now they're sort of coming to a level of maturity that enables us to have a conversation about, with the tools in place, how do we close this gap in execution and really get granular about the how of mobilizing capital into transition, and not just the philosophy of whether or not we need to do that.
And were there events where there are similar organizations to the Center for Sustainable Finance out there, and maybe even a few similar to Mindful Money in the Blue Zone? Were you kind of making contacts with others who are working on similar issues?
Yeah, making a lot of contacts with others. Most or many countries who have recognized the need to compete internationally for capital for transition have established some version of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, often held by the government or by regulators, and countries are having these pavilions so that they can compete essentially, right, on what their story is and what their country transition plan looks like, and then what they're doing to close it. So the conversation on country, I'll just take you through my 3 points if that's all right. The conversation on country specific plans. So this was reinforced by the GFAN's 2023 progress report, where they sort of highlighted some work that they've done thinking about what are the kind of enabling factors for the transition globally. And what GFANs have highlighted is that there's a need for kind of country platforms and really science-based transition pathways. And so while there's a global conversation happening about interoperability between reporting standards and disclosure regimes, so that we can make sure that the burden on companies is managed appropriately, and we're all, using consistent and comparable data and metrics, we also need to have a clarity of intent and investment strategies at a country level that are specific and appropriate for each country. So you can read more about that in the GFAN's 2023 progress report, which was released at COP. But if we think about New Zealand, and we think about the fact that we're about to go into, or we are already in the process of developing our second emissions reduction plan, then you might say that that could be our country roadmap, or the backbone of our country roadmap, along with the National Adaptation Plan. And now we have to get really clear about the potential sources and uses of private capital that can help us to achieve that roadmap, how we use blended finance, and what the kind of international capital flows are that we need to capture in order to meet our domestic objectives under those plans. And so what GFAN's sort of propose, and what we've been advocating to the government for, is that we have a sustainable finance roadmap. We think about and we plan for how we leverage private capital into our domestic transition and adaptation. Yeah.
And Jo,
Yep. Go ahead.
just on that, you and I previously talked about the danger of New Zealand being left behind others who are moving much faster on this agenda. And essentially capital flowing to places where there is more of an active government involvement, where there are signs of regulation and kind of the rules going further than they have in New Zealand. Was that what you saw at COP28? Was there evidence of New Zealand kind of slipping behind in those networks of rules and action?
I think that New Zealand would benefit from understanding what its own story is, right? We need a galvanizing framework and a vision for what New Zealand will look like in 2030 and 2050, and then kind of the roadmap for how we're going to get there. So it's difficult to answer that question in relation to all other countries. I would say in relation to key countries that we focus on quite a lot, such as Singapore and Australia and the UK and Europe, we're well behind, right? And even other, jurisdictions that might be less obvious are able to see that they will need to position and compete in the future to get into the stream of these green capital flows. So in the context of the peers that we like to compare ourselves to on some of these markers in terms of, a coordinated vision and strategy, and then clarity about what are the financing gaps in our key transition sectors and how do we set about closing those gaps, we're quite well behind.
Yeah. So other things, Jo, we're coming to a close for the seminar. Any sort of final thoughts?
Yeah, so the other two things that I mentioned was this idea of collaboration and specifically intermediaries to close the execution gap. So it was highlighted a number of times that in the context of bringing together catalytic capital, providers of capital such as philanthropists or multilateral development banks and governments, that investors are quite often not best placed to convene those platforms or those initiatives around specific projects. And so one of the organizations highlighted at COP that I thought would be useful to call out was highlighted at the Business and Philanthropy Summit, and that was Allied Climate Partners, which launched an $11 billion fund at COP. And they're a philanthropic investment organization with a mission to increase the number of bankable climate-related projects and businesses in emerging markets and developing economies. So they select regional investment managers and support them with capital and technical support to increase the number of climate-related projects and asset-oriented businesses. And so it was really useful to hear from their chief executive, who basically laid out this idea that there's been a tension between decarbonisation and development, and that actually decarbonisation is a huge opportunity for developing countries. But if you want to be remembered as a leader that changed the path of a country, for example, Singapore, then you need to sort of get on the train and realize this as an opportunity, and that intermediaries and those sort of honest brokers or other organizations such as the Green Finance Institute in the UK, they need to be part of thinking about how to put these blended finance opportunities together systemically, not just at a project level. So I think that there's something in that for New Zealand, because we've got so many people thinking about this in silos, but we don't have a great track record of collaborating to bring together big projects where everyone can make their, the necessary risk-adjusted returns to make the project attractive for them. And so that's the third and final point, is that we're finally having an honest conversation that certain actors need to make commercial returns, and that there are catalytic actors such as philanthropists and others who can accept concessionary returns, and they're really important part of the project. But then we have to acknowledge that to move money at scale, money needs to make money, and that's how you tap into those big pools of commercial money, and that there's a need for people who can bring those conversations and projects together.
Great. Sounds like we've got some work to do, Jo.
So much fun work ahead. What's really energizing about the whole COP, if I can leave with one note, it's that it's the catchphrase that was running around COP, optimism. It's so energizing, and the negotiations and then the media coverage of the negotiations, which tends toward hysteria, can be a little it can give you a sense that there's no action, and that we're at risk of going backwards, which of course we are in the negotiations if they don't go well. But there was hundreds of thousands of people on the ground in Dubai pushing for change. And if there's one thing I'd like to convey to the watchers and listeners of this recording, is that there's a really clear direction of travel. There's so much money involved, and we've just been working on getting the tools figured out. New Zealand needs to do more work on that. It, sort of got to get it together on that front. But the reorientation of the global financial system is happening, and we will get there. And so just keep going.
Thank you very much, Jo. And it's a great note to end on. And for all those of you who are looking at climate science and kind of wondering what's next after floods and storms and cyclones and forest fires and so on, then and all those who are deeply worried about tipping points, and those who are worried about what's the economic impacts of all of this, we have now Coptimism, and this is a great source of hope, because I mean, honestly, we do need it, and it was great to see it at COP28. Also, some really strong voices from the Pacific. The minister from Vanuatu, somebody who I worked with in a previous life when I was at Oxfam, Ralph Riganvanu, and he has really come into his own as a leader, and so it's great to see him getting prominence at COP28 and having the voice of vulnerable countries, because they are the ones who we need to ensure have hope moving forward. And so great to end on a positive note. Thanks to Rod, also in his absence, for joining us from the Emirates Lounge. And we look forward to seeing him back in New Zealand with lots more analysis of COP28. And so with this, we're going to close our seminar series. And I would like to thank the audiences for who've been with us today, and for other seminars, for coming along on the journey with us. We have generous sponsors who have supported us on this journey. Thanks very much to a top level sponsorship group for that. The fund manager Alfinity, Medical Assurance Society, known as MAS, MAS, Mercer, and New Zealand Green Investment Finance. So thanks very much to them for their great support. Also, thanks to Chapman Tripp, Booster, Harbour Asset Management, and Trustees Executors. And thanks also for contributions from Pathfinder and PyFunds. So that's the end of the story for the third Mindful Money seminar series. We are planning our fourth series to start next month in 2024. That will have some interesting new themes. It'll be a bit more of the podcast series, a little less of the video series. And we are planning a mix of these kind of set piece events, and then some in between more informal podcasts where we talk about some current news and things going on, and interview some interesting people. So keep an eye out for that. It's on our website. Sign up to our mailing list if you haven't already done that. If you're somebody who is in a position to do so, we would love some sponsorship for the next series. But above all, we'd love you to be able to enjoy the content of the series, to hear some great speakers like we have today, and to hopefully find out more about these important issues. So thanks for joining us. Stay active, invest mindfully. Nami nui kia koutou mā te wā.
I have one more thing to say, Barry. Thank you, and thank you to the team at Mindful Money for all the work that you're doing. This, despite the optimism, it's not a foregone conclusion how this is all going to go. And we, absolutely need to keep pushing. We absolutely need to, hold our financial institutions accountable and keep their feet to the fire. We should absolutely expect that, new oil and gas exploration wouldn't be able to receive finance from New Zealand financial institutions. For example, it's not all on our political leaders. And so I acknowledge the work that Mindful Money does, your steadfast commitment to making sure that we engage constructively in the finance sector in this whole agenda. And so thank you to you and to all of the team at Mindful Money as well.
Well, thank you, Jo. That's great. What a lovely note to end our series on. So thank you very much.
Ka kite.